20 Baby. Witnessed Mother Bear. Creating Forest Constitution for Animal Rights. What happened next? Put everyone in tears. The morning mist hung low over the forest floor, so thick that Ethan Marshall could barely see 10 feet ahead as he made his way along the familiar trail. He had been living in this remote cabin for 3 years now, far from the noise of the city he once called home, far from the constant buzz of notifications and deadlines that had once consumed his life. The silence here was different, not empty, but full of small sounds that meant something real. The crunch of pine needles under his boots, the distant call of a crow, the whisper of wind through ancient trees that had stood here long before he arrived and would stand long after he was gone. Ethan adjusted the small camera mounted on his chest, a habit from his new life as someone who documented the quiet moments of forest living for a small but dedicated online audience. They were people like him, seekers of peace, lovers of the slow and simple life that modern society had forgotten how to live. It was on this particular morning, with the sun just beginning to burn through the mist, that Ethan first noticed something that didn't belong. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. There, near the base of an old oak tree, stones had been arranged in a perfect line, each one roughly the same size, spaced with such precision that it couldn't be natural. He knelt down, running his fingers along the arrangement, feeling the deliberate placement of each stone. Who would come all the way out here to do this? His nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and even the most adventurous hikers rarely ventured this deep into the wilderness. Ethan stood up, brushing dirt from his knees, and that's when he noticed the second strange thing. About 20 feet away, branches had been woven together between 2 trees, creating a pattern that looked almost like writing, though not in any language he recognized. The discovery nagged at him throughout the day, as he chopped wood for his evening fire, as he prepared his simple meal of beans and rice, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the tree line. His mind kept returning to those stones and branches. That night, he mentioned it briefly to his camera, speaking in the soft, contemplative tone his viewers had come to expect. "Found something odd today," he said, the camera capturing the flickering light of his oil lamp on his weathered face. Stones arranged in lines, branches woven into patterns. Probably just kids from town playing some game, though I can't imagine them hiking this far just for that. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. There was something about the precision of it, the purposefulness, that suggested something else entirely. The next morning, Ethan returned to the spot, half expecting the arrangements to be gone, blown away by wind or scattered by animals. But they were still there, and more had been added. The line of stones now extended further, curving around a fallen log and continuing into the underbrush. The woven branches had companions now, 3 more similar structures at different heights on nearby trees. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the kind of curiosity he hadn't felt since he was a child, discovering secret places in his grandmother's garden. He decided to wait, to watch, to see who or what was responsible for this mystery. He didn't have to wait long. The sound came first. A soft huffing breath that made him freeze behind the large boulder where he had concealed himself. Then she appeared, massive and beautiful in the morning light, a mother bear with fur the color of dark honey. Behind her, staying close but occasionally distracted by interesting smells, was her cub, small enough that it couldn't have been more than a few months old. Ethan's first instinct was to back away slowly, to put distance between himself and the protective mother, but something in the bear's movement made him pause. She wasn't foraging, wasn't marking territory in the way he had seen bears do before. She was working. The mother bear moved with deliberate purpose to a pile of stones near the creek bed. Using her massive paws with surprising delicacy, she selected specific stones, examining each one before either setting it aside or carrying it in her mouth to add to the growing line. The cub watched intently, occasionally trying to help by pushing smaller stones with its tiny paws, though the mother would often gently correct its placement with a soft rumble that sounded almost like instruction. Ethan's hands trembled as he slowly, carefully raised his camera, not wanting to miss this impossible moment. His whispered narration was barely audible, meant more for himself than his future viewers. This can't be real. She's building something, teaching something. For the next 2 hours, Ethan watched in absolute stillness as the mother bear, whom he found himself thinking of as Ursa, continued her work. She would place a stone, step back to examine it, sometimes adjusting its position by mere inches until it satisfied some criteria only she understood. When the sun reached a certain angle through the trees, she moved to the woven branches, adding new twigs and strips of bark, creating patterns within patterns. The cub, whom Ethan had begun calling Coda in his mind, tried to imitate, its clumsy attempts bringing what could only be described as patient correction from its mother. The most extraordinary moment came when a deer wandered into the clearing. Ethan tensed, expecting Ursa to react with aggression, or at least wariness. Instead, the deer paused at the line of stones, looked directly at Ursa, and then carefully stepped over the line rather than crossing it randomly. The deer continued on its way, and Ursa returned to her work as if this was completely normal. Ethan's mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of boundary marking? But bears didn't typically create boundaries, and certainly not ones that deer would respect. The whole thing defied everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. As the days passed, Ethan found himself returning to the spot every morning, each time discovering new additions to what he had begun to think of as Ursa's project. The patterns grew more complex, spreading throughout this section of forest like a network of silent communication. He started mapping them in his notebook, trying to find a pattern or meaning, but it remained just beyond his understanding. His evening videos to his small audience became filled with wonder and questions. "I've been watching something extraordinary," he would say, careful not to reveal too much, not wanting to betray the trust of this secret he had stumbled upon. Nature has languages we haven't even begun to understand. One morning, about a week after his first sighting, Ethan witnessed something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the natural world. A family of rabbits had made their warren near one of Ursa's stone arrangements. A fox, lean and hungry-looking, stalked toward them with the focused intensity of a predator. Ethan watched, knowing he was about to witness the harsh reality of nature, the circle of life that he had accepted as part of living in the wilderness. But as the fox approached the stone line, it stopped. Not hesitated, but completely stopped, as if it had hit an invisible wall. The fox looked at the stones, then at the rabbits just beyond them, then back at the stones. After a long moment, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the underbrush. Ethan's hands shook as he lowered his binoculars. This wasn't just marking or communication. This was something else entirely, something that suggested a level of understanding and agreement between species that science said was impossible. He thought about all the nature documentaries he had watched, all the books he had read about animal behavior, and none of them had ever suggested anything like this. Yet here it was, happening right in front of him, as real as the morning mist that still clung to the forest floor. That evening, unable to sleep, Ethan sat on his porch and thought about what he was witnessing. His grandmother had once told him that animals had their own wisdom, their own ways of understanding the world that humans had forgotten in their rush toward civilization. He had thought it was just the romantic notion of an old woman who spent too much time in her garden, talking to her cats and leaving food out for the birds. But now, watching Ursa work with such purpose, seeing other animals respond to her creation with what could only be described as respect, he wondered if his grandmother had known something that modern science had missed. The next development came 3 days later and changed everything. Ethan had positioned himself in his usual hiding spot when Ursa arrived with Coda, but this time they weren't alone. Following them was an old raccoon, moving slowly but deliberately, carrying something in its mouth. The raccoon placed what it was carrying, a collection of small shells from the creek, at a specific spot near one of the woven branch patterns. Ursa examined the offering, then used her paw to move the shells into a different arrangement. The raccoon watched, then chittered softly, and Ursa responded with a low rumble. It was communication, clear and unmistakable, though the language was beyond Ethan's comprehension. More animals began to appear over the following days. A family of squirrels brought acorns, placing them in designated spots that Ursa had marked with smaller stones. A lone wolf, which should have sent every other animal fleeing, approached with a piece of its kill, setting it down at what appeared to be a central collection point before retreating to a respectful distance. Each animal seemed to understand its role in whatever system Ursa had created, and each followed the rules that the stones and branches seemed to represent. Ethan began to notice patterns within patterns. The stone lines weren't random, but created pathways and boundaries that different animals used at different times. The woven branches seemed to indicate resources, with different patterns perhaps meaning different things. Water here, food there, danger beyond. It was like watching the development of a civilization in fast forward, but instead of humans building cities and writing laws, it was a bear creating order in the wilderness, and other animals accepting and participating in that order. The emotional weight of what he was witnessing began to affect Ethan in ways he didn't expect. He found himself crying one evening as he watched his footage from the day, seeing Ursa gently teaching Coda how to weave branches, the patience and love evident in every movement. It reminded him of his own mother, teaching him to tie his shoes, to write his name, to be kind to others even when the world wasn't kind to you. The parallel was so unexpected, so powerful, that he had to stop the video and step outside, letting the cool night air dry his tears. His followers online had noticed the change in his videos, where once he had shared simple moments of forest life, cooking over a fire, identifying birds by their songs, repairing his cabin. Now there was something deeper in his voice, a sense of awe that he couldn't quite hide. "I'm witnessing something that's changing how I see everything," he told them one night, the camera catching the reflection of stars in his eyes. "We think we're the only ones who create societies, who have rules and cooperation, but I'm learning that maybe we're just the only ones who write them down in words." The young woman who appeared at the edge of the clearing 2 weeks after Ethan's first sighting shouldn't have been there. Ethan recognized her immediately, Jessica Brooks, a graduate student from the university who had contacted him months ago about using his land for some kind of research. He had politely declined, wanting to maintain his solitude, but here she was anyway, camera in hand, eyes wide as she watched Ursa working on her latest addition to the growing network of symbols. Ethan felt a surge of protective anger. This was not meant for the academic world, not meant to be studied and categorized and published in journals. He emerged from his hiding spot, startling Jessica, who nearly dropped her camera. "You need to leave," he said quietly but firmly, aware that Ursa had noticed them both and was watching with what seemed like wariness. "This isn't what you think it is." Jessica started to protest, talking about scientific discovery and the importance of documentation, but Ethan cut her off. Some things are meant to be witnessed, not studied. Please, just go. Something in his voice, perhaps the deep sincerity or the protective edge, made her lower her camera. She looked at Ursa, then at the intricate patterns surrounding them, and finally nodded, backing away slowly before disappearing into the forest. Ethan knew she would be back, probably with others, but for now, the secret was safe. He turned to find Ursa watching him, and for a moment their eyes met. There was intelligence there, he was certain of it, and perhaps even understanding. She huffed softly, then returned to her work, and Ethan felt like he had passed some kind of test. He was allowed to stay, allowed to witness, as long as he remained just that, a witness, not an intruder. As the weeks turned into a month, the forest section that Ursa had claimed as her project space had transformed into something that defied easy description. It was part art installation, part communication network, part social contract. Animals that would normally avoid each other now shared space peacefully, following the invisible rules that Ursa's symbols seemed to represent. Predators still hunted, but not within certain boundaries. Prey animals still fled, but they had safe zones marked by the stones where they could rest without fear. It was nature, but nature with a structure that suggested consciousness and choice rather than just instinct. Coda was growing, and with that growth came increased participation in his mother's work. He no longer just watched, but actively helped, his movements becoming more precise, his understanding of the patterns more evident. Ethan watched one morning as Coda independently created a small stone arrangement, and Ursa inspected it, adjusted a few stones, then gave what could only be described as approval, a gentle nuzzle that made Coda bounce with what looked like pride. The human parallel was so strong that Ethan had to remind himself these were bears, not people in fursuits playing out some elaborate performance. The day that changed everything started like any other. Ethan arrived at his observation spot before dawn, settling in to wait for Ursa and Coda to begin their daily work. But as the sun rose, he noticed other animals gathering, more than he had ever seen at once. Deer, rabbits, squirrels, even a pair of foxes, all maintaining respectful distances from each other but all clearly waiting for something. Then Ursa appeared, but instead of beginning her usual work, she moved to a large, flat stone that Ethan had noticed but never seen her use. She sat in front of it, Coda beside her, and waited. What happened next would stay with Ethan for the rest of his life. One by one, animals approached the stone. Each brought something: food, shiny objects from the creek, particularly beautiful feathers, and placed their offerings in front of Ursa. She would examine each gift, then use her paw to either push it to one side or the other of the stone. The animals whose offerings were pushed to the left would take them and leave. Those whose offerings went to the right would stay, forming a growing circle around Ursa and the stone. When all the offerings had been sorted, Ursa began to work on the stone itself, using a piece of charcoal from an old forest fire to make marks. The watching animals were silent, attentive, and Ethan realized with a start that he was witnessing some kind of meeting, a gathering where decisions were being made that would affect all of them. The marks Ursa made were different from the patterns in the branches, more complex, and the animals seemed to understand them. A deer stepped forward at one point, pawing at the ground in what seemed like disagreement, and Ursa paused, considered, then modified one of her marks. The deer settled back, apparently satisfied. The meeting, for lack of a better word, lasted until the sun was high overhead. When it ended, the animals dispersed, but not randomly. They moved with purpose, some heading to specific stone arrangements, others to the woven branches, all apparently having received instructions or assignments that Ethan couldn't begin to understand. Ursa remained by the stone with Coda, and for the first time she looked tired. The weight of whatever responsibility she had taken on was visible in the slope of her shoulders. The slow way she finally stood and led Coda back into the deeper forest. Ethan sat in his hiding spot long after they had gone, trying to process what he had seen. His rational mind kept trying to find mundane explanations, but none of them fit. This wasn't just unusual animal behavior that could be explained by instinct or conditioning. This was organization, governance, society. The implications were staggering. If animals could create their own systems of law and cooperation, what did that mean for humanity's assumption of superiority? What did it mean for how we treated the natural world? That night, he sat in front of his camera for a long time before speaking. "I've been debating whether to share this," he finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of decision. "What I'm witnessing here challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. But maybe that's exactly why I need to share it. Carefully, respectfully, but honestly." He didn't give specifics, didn't reveal the location or the exact nature of what he was seeing. But he talked about the intelligence he was witnessing, the cooperation, the sense of purpose that went beyond survival. The response from his followers was immediate and varied. Some thought he was creating fiction, a beautiful story, but nothing more. Others believed him and wanted to know more, to see proof. A few understood what he was really saying, that sometimes the most profound truths are the ones we keep closest to our hearts, witnessed but not exploited. These were the people who understood why he was being vague, why he was protecting this secret even as he shared its essence. As the season began to change, the leaves starting their slow transformation from green to gold, Ethan noticed changes in Ursa's project as well. The patterns became more elaborate, extending further into the forest, creating a network that now covered several acres. More animals had joined what Ethan had come to think of as the forest parliament, including some he wouldn't have expected. A hawk had taken to perching on a specific branch during the gatherings. A snake, of all things, had a designated sunning rock that other animals avoided but didn't fear. The most remarkable addition came in the form of an elderly badger, scarred and moving slowly, who seemed to hold some special position in the hierarchy. When the badger appeared, even Ursa showed deference, stepping aside to let it examine her work, accepting what appeared to be corrections or suggestions with patient attention. Ethan wondered about the history there. What experiences had led to a bear respecting a badger's wisdom? What stories the forest held that no human would ever know? Coda was growing rapidly, and his understanding of his mother's work grew with him. Ethan watched him actually teaching, a younger bear cub who had started following them around. The patience Coda showed, the careful demonstration of how to place stones just so, how to weave branches in the correct pattern, was a perfect mirror of how Ursa had taught him. It was generational knowledge being passed down, and Ethan realized that this wasn't just Ursa's project anymore. It was becoming something larger, something that would outlast her. The day Jessica returned, she wasn't alone. With her were 2 other researchers and what looked like enough equipment to set up a full field station. Ethan intercepted them before they could reach the heart of Ursa's territory, his stance making it clear they weren't welcome. "You don't understand what you're about to disturb," he said, trying to keep his voice calm despite his rising panic. "This isn't just animal behavior you're going to study. It's sacred." Jessica's companion, an older man with the bearing of a tenured professor, scoffed at the word sacred. "We're scientists," he said, with the kind of condescension that made Ethan's jaw clench. "We don't deal in sacred, we deal in facts. And if what Jessica described is even partially true, this could revolutionize our understanding of animal cognition." The man started to push past Ethan, but stopped when a low growl rumbled through the forest. Ursa emerged from the trees, larger than life, her eyes fixed on the intruders. Behind her, other animals appeared: deer, foxes, even the old badger, all watching with what could only be described as unified purpose. The researchers froze, their scientific bravado evaporating in the face of this united front. Ursa didn't charge, didn't even move closer, but her message was clear. These outsiders were not welcome. The professor tried to raise his camera, but a crow dove from above, knocking it from his hands. A squirrel chittered angrily from a branch directly overhead, and the message became even clearer. "Leave. Now." Jessica tugged on the professor's arm, and after a long moment of standoff they retreated, their equipment unused, their study unmade. Ethan turned to find Ursa watching him again, and this time he was sure he saw approval in her dark eyes. He had protected their secret, had stood as a guardian between their world and the harsh scrutiny of human science. He nodded to her, a gesture of respect and understanding, and she huffed softly before melting back into the forest, her followers dispersing with her. The message was clear. Ethan could stay because he understood the difference between witnessing and exploiting, between learning and taking. As autumn deepened, the forest's transformation mirrored the evolution of Ursa's creation. The stone patterns now included different colors of rock, creating what looked like a map or perhaps a calendar. The woven branches had dried and hardened, becoming permanent fixtures that would last through winter. New elements had been added, hollowed logs that served as message centers where animals left and retrieved objects, elevated platforms where food was shared according to some system of need that Ethan couldn't quite decipher but could see working. The emotional impact of watching this society develop affected Ethan in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself thinking about human civilization differently, about how we too had started with simple agreements, marks on stones, shared resources. But somewhere along the way, we had complicated it, had lost the direct connection between need and response, between individual and community. Watching Ursa's parliament, he saw something pure, uncorrupted by ego or greed, focused entirely on survival not just of individuals but of the collective. One particularly cold morning, Ethan arrived to find chaos. A young bear, not Coda but another adolescent, had destroyed part of the stone arrangements, scattering carefully placed rocks and breaking woven branches. The other animals watched from a distance as Ursa surveyed the damage, Coda beside her. Ethan expected anger, perhaps even violence, but what happened instead broke his heart with its humanity. Ursa approached the young destroyer slowly, and instead of attacking, she began to rebuild, deliberately, patiently. After a moment, she nudged the young bear, inviting it to help. The young bear resisted at first, but Ursa persisted, showing it how to place the stones, how to weave the branches. Gradually, the youngster began to participate, clumsily at first, then with growing understanding. By the end of the day, not only had the damage been repaired, but the young bear had become part of the community. Another student learning the laws that Ursa had created. It was rehabilitation rather than punishment, education rather than exile, and Ethan found himself wiping tears from his eyes at the wisdom of it. His videos had become something of a phenomenon in his small online community. Without revealing specifics, he shared the emotional journey of witnessing something extraordinary, of being changed by observation of the natural world. People wrote to him about finding similar moments of wonder in their own environments, of learning to see the intelligence and purpose in the animals around them. He had started something, a movement perhaps, of people choosing to witness rather than interfere, to learn rather than teach. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the forest in white that made Ursa's pattern stand out even more clearly. The stones created dark lines through the snow. The woven branches held white caps like intentional decorations. Ethan watched as animals adjusted their behavior to the weather, using Ursa's pathways to move efficiently through the snow, gathering at the designated sharing points where food was scarce, but somehow never completely absent. It was during this first snow that Ethan witnessed what he would later think of as the most beautiful moment of all. A rabbit, thin and clearly struggling with the early winter, approached one of the food-sharing stations to find it empty. The rabbit sat there, perhaps too weak to continue searching. Then Coda appeared, carrying something in his mouth. Instead of passing by, he stopped, dropped what he was carrying, a cache of dried berries, at the rabbit's feet, and continued on his way. A bear, a natural predator, feeding a rabbit, its natural prey, because the system his mother had created valued life over instinct. The profundity of it hit Ethan like a physical force. This wasn't just unusual animal behavior. This was evolution happening in real time. Not biological evolution, but social, cognitive, perhaps even moral evolution. These animals were choosing to be more than their instincts dictated, to create a society based on mutual benefit rather than pure survival of the fittest. It challenged not just scientific understanding, but philosophical assumptions about consciousness, free will, and the nature of morality itself. Winter settled over the forest like a heavy blanket, and Ethan expected Ursa's activities to slow or stop. Instead, they evolved. The gatherings moved to a sheltered grove where the snow was less deep. The stone patterns were maintained despite the weather, with various animals taking turns clearing snow from important markers. The woven branches were reinforced with mud that froze solid, creating structures that could withstand the weight of snow and ice. The winter gatherings were different from the autumn ones, more focused on survival than governance. Ursa would mark certain trees, and Ethan observed that these were the ones where squirrels had large nut caches. But instead of raiding them, other animals would only take from them in what appeared to be shifts, ensuring the squirrels kept enough for themselves while sharing the excess with others. It was resource management at a level that many human communities struggled to achieve. One day, Ethan noticed something troubling. Ursa was moving more slowly, her breath coming in visible puffs even when she wasn't exerting herself. She was old, he realized, older than he had initially thought. The responsibility she carried, the constant work of maintaining this system, was taking its toll. Coda seemed to sense it too, taking on more of the work, but he was still young, still learning. The thought that Ursa might not survive the winter sent a chill through Ethan that had nothing to do with the temperature. He began to document more intensively, feeling an urgency to capture what might be lost. But he was careful to maintain his distance, to remain the observer rather than the participant. He had learned that his role was to witness, not to interfere, no matter how much he might want to help. The animals had their own ways of dealing with age and illness, and his human intervention would only disturb the delicate balance that had been created. The crisis came during a particularly severe blizzard. Ethan couldn't make it to his observation spot for 3 days, and when he finally did, he found the animal community in disarray. Ursa was absent, and without her guidance, some of the younger animals had begun to ignore the boundaries, crossing stone lines and taking more than their share from the food caches. Coda was trying to maintain order, but he lacked his mother's authority, her presence that commanded respect. Then, through the swirling snow, Ursa appeared. She moved slowly, painfully, but with undeniable purpose. She went straight to the large flat stone where the important gatherings were held and struck it with her paw, the sound ringing through the forest despite the muffling snow. Animals appeared from all directions, gathering in the circle that had become their parliament. What followed was clearly a transfer of authority, though the exact mechanism was beyond Ethan's understanding. Ursa would touch a pattern, then guide Koda's paw to it. She would make a sound, and he would repeat it. By the end of the gathering, the dynamic had shifted. The other animals now looked to Koda with the same attention they had given Ursa, though she remained present, a guiding force rather than the primary leader. It was succession planning, Ethan realized, something human organizations often failed to do well, handled with a grace and wisdom that took his breath away. The community would continue beyond its founder. The system would outlive its creator. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Ethan watched the Forest Society continue to evolve under Koda's leadership. He was different from his mother, less patient perhaps, but more innovative. He added new elements to the system, including what appeared to be designated play areas where young animals of different species could interact safely. It was forward-thinking, focused not just on survival, but on the quality of life, on the social development of the young. Ursa was still present, but taking a more advisory role. She would appear at important gatherings, offer what seemed like suggestions or corrections, but the day-to-day management had passed to Koda. Watching them work together, the old wisdom guiding the young energy, Ethan was reminded of his own relationship with his grandfather, who had taught him woodworking, not by lecturing, but by working alongside him, letting him make mistakes and learn from them. The spring brought new challenges and new additions to the community. Migrating birds discovered the system and somehow integrated themselves into it, using the elevated platforms as nesting sites in exchange for what appeared to be sentinel duty, warning of approaching threats. A family of beavers moved into the nearby stream and immediately began working with Ursa and Koda to create water management systems that benefited everyone. It was like watching civilization develop in fast forward, each new addition bringing complexity but also stability. Ethan's documentation had filled dozens of notebooks by now, sketches and observations that he knew would never see academic publication, but that felt important to record nonetheless. He had stopped making videos about it, feeling that even his vague references were too much exposure for something this precious. Instead, he simply lived with the knowledge, let it change him, let it inform how he moved through the world. The young woman who appeared at his cabin one evening wasn't Jessica or any researcher. She introduced herself as Lily Morgan, an artist who had heard rumors of something extraordinary in these woods. She wasn't looking to study or expose, she said, but to understand, to perhaps capture something of the essence in her art without revealing the source. Something in her manner, a quietness, a respect for the unknown, made Ethan consider her request. He brought her to the edge of Ursa's territory the next morning, far enough to observe but not to disturb. Lily's reaction was immediate and profound. She didn't reach for a camera or notebook but simply stood there, tears streaming down her face as she watched Koda teaching a group of young animals how to read the stone patterns. "It's like watching the first human paint on a cave wall," she whispered. "Except we're not the first, are we? We're not the only ones who create meaning." Lily returned several times over the following weeks, always respectful, always maintaining the distance Ethan required. She would sit and sketch, not the animals themselves, but the patterns they created, the abstract representation of their communication system. Her art, when she finally showed it to Ethan, was beautiful and mysterious. capturing the essence of what was happening without revealing its source. It was exactly the kind of tribute this secret deserved. The summer solstice brought the largest gathering Ethan had yet witnessed. Animals came from miles around. Some he had never seen in this part of the forest before. Ursa, despite her age, presided over the gathering with Coda, and together they seemed to be establishing new territories, new agreements that would extend the system beyond its current boundaries. It was expansion, but not through conquest. It was invitation, incorporation, a growing network of cooperation that defied everything humans thought they knew about territorial animals. The meeting lasted from dawn until dusk, and by its end, the stone patterns had been extended in 4 new directions, creating paths that led to other parts of the forest. Animals that had attended left in groups, apparently taking the knowledge with them to establish similar systems in their own territories. Ethan realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, the spread of culture among wild animals, the conscious adoption of a social system that transcended species boundaries. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan sat on his porch and contemplated what he had witnessed over the past months. He had come to the forest seeking solitude, escape from human complexity, only to discover that complexity existed everywhere, that intelligence and society were not unique to humans but were perhaps fundamental properties of conscious beings, regardless of their form. The humility this realization brought was profound, reshaping his entire worldview. A soft sound made him look up to find Coda at the edge of his clearing, watching him. They regarded each other for a long moment, 2 conscious beings acknowledging each other across the vast divide of species. Then Coda turned and melted back into the forest, leaving Ethan with the feeling that he had been checked on, that his presence here was not just tolerated but somehow incorporated into the grand design that Ursa had started and Coda now maintained. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of observation and wonder. The system continued to grow and evolve, adapting to new challenges with a flexibility that spoke to its organic nature. It wasn't rigid law but living agreement, constantly negotiated and renegotiated as circumstances changed. When drought threatened the water supply, the beavers and bears worked together to create retention pools. When an early frost threatened food supplies, the sharing system adjusted to ensure the most vulnerable were protected. Ethan found himself changed by what he was witnessing. He moved through the world differently now, seeing intelligence and purpose in every creature he encountered. His isolation no longer felt like escape, but like participation in something larger, a vast web of consciousness that included, but wasn't limited to humanity. He had sought simplicity and found complexity. He had sought silence and found communication. He had sought solitude and found community. The autumn moon hung full and bright over the forest, casting silver shadows through the canopy as Ethan made his way along the now familiar path. He had been following this route for months now, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that made every cricket's chirp seem louder, every rustle of leaves more significant. He had received what he could only describe as an invitation, though it hadn't come in any form a human would recognize as communication. It had been a series of small signs left near his cabin over the past week. A perfectly round stone on his doorstep one morning. A woven branch pattern hung from his porch rail another day, and finally, this morning, Coda himself standing at the forest edge, waiting until Ethan saw him before walking slowly into the woods, looking back once as if to say, "Follow." Now, as Ethan moved deeper into the forest than he had ever ventured for his observations, he wondered what he was being led to witness. The path Coda had taken wasn't random. It followed the stone lines that had been extended over the summer, leading toward what Ethan had always thought of as the heart of the forest. the oldest part where trees grew so large that 3 people holding hands couldn't wrap their arms around them. The air here was different, thicker with age and mystery, carrying scents of deep earth and ancient wood that spoke of centuries passing unmarked by human time. The sound reached him before the sight, a low humming that wasn't quite animal but wasn't wind either. It was rhythmic, purposeful, almost like the chanting he remembered from his grandmother's church, but without words, without human structure. As he crested a small rise, following the stone path that glowed pale in the moonlight, the forest opened into a clearing he had never seen before, and what he witnessed there stopped him in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat as his mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. The clearing was perfectly circular, surrounded by the massive ancient trees whose branches formed a natural cathedral ceiling overhead. In the center stood a stone unlike anything else in the forest, a natural monolith that rose perhaps 10 feet from the ground, its surface smooth as if polished by countless years of wind and rain. But it wasn't just the stone that made Ethan's knees weak. It was what surrounded it. Animals of every species he had come to know over his months of observation were arranged in concentric circles around the stone. Bears, deer, foxes, rabbits, squirrels, even predatory birds perched in the branches above, all maintaining perfect stillness, all facing the center where Ursa stood with Coda at her side. But they weren't alone at the stone. The old badger was there, along with what appeared to be the eldest members of various species, an ancient owl with clouded eyes, a wolf so gray it was almost white, a doe with a coat gone pale with age. They formed an inner circle, and Ethan realized with a start that he was looking at something like a council of elders, the wisdom keepers of the forest. The humming was coming from them, though how a badger and an owl could create the same sound was beyond his understanding. It wasn't vocalization as he knew it, but something deeper, more fundamental, like the vibration of life itself. Ursa moved then, her massive form graceful despite her age and the stiffness Ethan had noticed in recent weeks. She approached the monolith and placed her paw on its surface, and that's when Ethan saw them clearly for the first time. The stone was covered in markings, not random scratches, but deliberate symbols that looked almost like the pictographs he had seen in museums, the earliest attempts at human writing. But these weren't human-made. These were older, different, a language that had developed independently of any human influence. Some of the symbols he recognized from Ursa's work throughout the forest, but others were different, older-looking, as if this stone had been marked by generations of creatures before Ursa had added her contributions. The marking ceremony, for that's what Ethan realized he was witnessing, continued as each elder approached the stone in turn. The old wolf used its claw to add a small symbol near the base. The ancient owl dropped a feather that somehow adhered to the stone's surface, becoming part of the record. The badger pushed small stones into crevices, creating a pattern within the larger design. Each addition was witnessed by the assembled animals with what could only be described as reverence, a shared understanding of the importance of what was being recorded. Then Ursa did something that made Ethan's heart skip. She guided Coda forward, placing his paw on a blank section of the stone. The young bear looked at his mother, then at the assembled council before carefully, deliberately, making his first mark on the ancient record. It was simple, just 3 lines that intersected in a particular way, but the weight of the moment was palpable. This was initiation, acceptance, the formal transfer of responsibility from one generation to the next. Coda wasn't just learning his mother's system anymore. He was being inducted into something far older, far deeper than what Ethan had been observing. The ceremony continued as other younger animals were brought forward. Not all of them, Ethan noticed, but selected ones who seemed to have shown particular understanding or commitment to the communal system. Each made a small mark under the guidance of an elder, and each mark was met with that strange humming sound from the assembly. It was like watching the creation of a constitution, but one that was living, growing, amended not through debate and vote, but through collective wisdom and witnessed agreement. As the moon reached its zenith, the formal portion of the gathering seemed to conclude. The rigid circles dissolved into something more fluid, though still organized. Animals that would normally never interact moved among each other with what looked like purposeful communication. Ethan watched a fox and a rabbit pause near each other, the fox making a series of gestures with its head that the rabbit seemed to respond to with movements of its own. They weren't using the human concept of language, but they were absolutely communicating, exchanging information in ways that human science had never imagined possible. The really extraordinary moment came when Ursa noticed Ethan at the edge of the clearing. He had thought himself well hidden, but her eyes found him unerringly in the shadows. For a moment he feared he had violated something sacred, that his presence would disrupt this incredible gathering. But Ursa simply looked at him, then made a gesture with her head that was unmistakably an invitation. She was asking him to come closer, to be part of this moment not as an observer but as a witness in the formal sense, someone whose presence acknowledged and validated what was happening. Ethan's legs shook as he stepped into the clearing. Every animal turned to look at him, and he felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, each pair holding intelligence, awareness, judgment. But there was no hostility, no fear, just a kind of curious acceptance. He was known to them, he realized. His months of quiet observation had made him a familiar presence, and his refusal to exploit or expose their secret had earned him something like trust. He moved slowly, carefully, until he stood at the edge of the inner circle, close enough to see the details of the stone's markings but maintaining a respectful distance from the elders. What happened next would remain the most profound moment of Ethan's life. Ursa approached him, her massive form moving with surprising grace, and extended her paw, not in threat, but in offering. In her paw was a small piece of charcoal, and she was gesturing toward a small section of the stone, a place where the human observer could add his own mark to this record. Ethan's hands trembled as he accepted the charcoal, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. He was being asked to be part of this, to add his witness to whatever record this stone represented. He thought carefully before making his mark. Not a word, not a human symbol, but something simpler, more universal. He drew a circle with a dot in the center, a symbol that could mean many things: an eye watching, the sun, unity with a central purpose. When he stepped back, the humming sound rose again, and he realized with a shock that it was now including him, that somehow his presence had been incorporated into this collective expression. He wasn't separate anymore, wasn't just the human observer, but had become part of the witnessed agreement, the acknowledged community of conscious beings who had chosen cooperation over conflict. The gathering continued until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. As the first birds began their morning songs, the animals started to disperse, but not in the random scatter Ethan might have expected. They left in groups, organized by some principle he couldn't quite grasp, each group seeming to have a purpose, a destination, a role to play in the larger system that the stone represented. Ursa was among the last to leave, but before she did, she approached Ethan once more. She huffed softly, a sound he had come to recognize as acknowledgement, perhaps even approval, then touched her nose briefly to his hand before turning and walking into the forest with Coda at her side. Ethan remained in the clearing as the sun rose fully, studying the stone in the daylight. The markings were even more complex than he had realized in the moonlight. layers upon layers of symbols, some so old they were barely visible, others fresh and clear. It was a history, he realized, a record of agreements and laws, and perhaps even stories that stretched back who knew how long. How many generations of animals had contributed to this record? How long had this system of cooperation existed in parallel to human civilization, unnoticed and unacknowledged? The implications were staggering. If animals had been creating their own societies, their own laws and agreements, for generations or perhaps even centuries, what did that mean for humanity's understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and our place in the natural world? Were we really the only species capable of creating civilization, or were we simply the only ones who did it in a way we could recognize? The humility this thought brought was profound, reshaping everything Ethan thought he knew about the world. Over the following days, Ethan noticed changes in the forest that seemed to stem from the gathering at the stone. The stone pathways were extended and modified, creating new routes that connected to areas he had never seen marked before. The sharing stations were reorganized, with what appeared to be new rules about distribution that took into account the changing season and the approaching winter. Most remarkably, he observed what could only be described as teaching sessions, where older animals demonstrated the meaning of various symbols to younger ones, a formal education system that ensured the knowledge would be passed on. The young artist Lily returned during this time, and Ethan, still moved by what he had witnessed, brought her closer to the heart of the mystery than before. He showed her some of the more complex pattern work, though he kept the stone and its clearing secret. Her response was to sit in silence for nearly an hour, just absorbing what she was seeing, before finally speaking. "We've been so arrogant," she said softly, tears in her eyes, thinking we were the only ones who could create meaning, who could choose to be more than our instincts. But look at this. They're writing their own story, creating their own meaning, and they've been doing it all along. We just never thought to look. Her artwork from these sessions was extraordinary. She didn't try to literally depict what she saw, but instead created abstract pieces that captured the essence of interspecies cooperation, of communication beyond language, of intelligence unrecognized. She showed them only to Ethan, understanding that this secret was not hers to reveal, but the paintings themselves radiated a kind of truth that didn't need explanation. Anyone who saw them would feel something shift in their understanding, even if they couldn't say exactly what or why. Winter came early and hard that year, with snows that buried the forest in white silence. Ethan worried about how the animals would maintain their system under such harsh conditions, but he needn't have concerned himself. The preparation that had been made during the autumn gathering became clear as the forest community adapted to the challenges with remarkable efficiency. The stone paths became highways through the snow, maintained by regular traffic that kept them clear. The sharing stations were stocked before each storm, with animals contributing according to their ability and taking according to their need. But it was Ursa who worried him most. Her movements had become increasingly labored, and she spent more time resting than working. Coda had taken on almost all of the daily maintenance of their system, but he still deferred to his mother for major decisions, seeking her approval for any significant changes. Watching them together, the young strength supporting the aging wisdom, Ethan was reminded of his own father's final years, how he had gradually taken on more responsibility while still treasuring every moment of guidance he could receive. The crisis came during a particularly severe blizzard that lasted 3 days. When Ethan finally made it to his observation post, he found the community in distress. Ursa was lying in the sheltered grove where winter gatherings were held, her breathing shallow and labored. Animals of all species had gathered around her, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly standing vigil. Koda sat beside his mother, his paw resting gently on hers, and the grief in his posture was unmistakable and heartbreaking. What followed was unlike anything Ethan had ever witnessed or imagined. One by one, animals approached Ursa, each bringing something. Not food or practical offerings, but items of beauty or significance. A blue jay brought a particularly beautiful feather. A squirrel offered an perfectly formed acorn. The old badger pushed forward a smooth river stone that seemed to glow in the weak winter light. They were paying tribute, Ethan realized, honoring not just a leader, but the architect of their peace, the creator of a system that had transformed their lives. Ursa acknowledged each offering with the smallest movement of her head, her eyes still bright with intelligence even as her body failed. When the last animal had paid their respects, she turned to Koda and, with obvious effort, placed her paw on his head. It was a blessing, a final transfer of authority, a mother's last gift to her son. Then she looked directly at Ethan, holding his gaze for a long moment before closing her eyes. She didn't open them again, though her breathing continued, increasingly shallow through the night. By morning, Ursa was gone. The forest itself seemed to mourn, with even the wind falling silent as word spread through the community. Animals gathered from throughout the territory, more than Ethan had ever seen in one place, forming those same concentric circles they had made at the stone gathering. But this time, instead of celebration or ceremony, there was grief, palpable and shared across species boundaries. A rabbit pressed against a fox for comfort, neither acknowledging the strangeness of it. Birds landed on the backs of deer, all facing inward where Ursa's still form lay in the snow. Koda's grief was the most affecting. The young bear, now not so young anymore, sat beside his mother's body and made sounds Ethan had never heard from a bear before. Low, keening notes that spoke of loss in a language that needed no translation. Other bears approached and surrounded him, their presence offering silent support, but also something more. They were acknowledging him, Ethan realized, accepting him fully as Ursa's successor, as the new keeper of the law she had created. What happened next challenged every assumption Ethan had about animal behavior and consciousness. The animals worked together to move Ursa's body, not dragging it away as he might have expected, but carrying it with careful dignity to a special place Ethan had never seen before, a grove where the trees grew in a perfect circle. There they had somehow prepared a resting place, a depression in the earth lined with pine boughs and decorated with the offerings that had been brought to her. It was a burial, deliberate and ceremonial, showing an understanding of death and remembrance that science said animals didn't possess. As Ursa was laid to rest, each animal added something to the grave. Stones were placed in patterns around the edges, branches woven into protective barriers, earth carefully mounted and patted down. The entire process took hours, with animals taking turns in the work, maintaining an organization that spoke to planning and coordination. When it was complete, the grave looked like a natural part of the forest, but one that any creature who knew the signs would recognize as special, sacred even. Koda was the last to leave the gravesite, but before he did, he performed one final act that broke Ethan's heart completely. The young bear carefully placed the first stone he had ever positioned under his mother's guidance, a small round river rock that Ethan remembered from those early days of observation, on top of the mound. Then he sat back and gave one last keening cry that echoed through the forest, before turning and walking away, his posture speaking of grief, but also determination, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a visible burden. In the days that followed, Ethan watched as the forest community adjusted to the loss of its founder. There were challenges, moments when Koda's youth and inexperience showed, when older animals questioned his decisions or younger ones tested boundaries. But the system Ursa had created was stronger than any individual, even its creator. The laws held, the cooperation continued, and gradually Kota grew into his role, finding his own way to lead that honored his mother's vision while adapting to new challenges. The most remarkable development came about a month after Ursa's passing. Ethan arrived at the central stone to find Kota there with several other bears, including the young troublemaker who Ursa had rehabilitated. Together, they were adding new markings to the stone, not replacing Ursa's symbols but adding to them, creating new patterns that built on the old foundation. It was evolution, not revolution, and it showed a sophisticated understanding of how societies grow and change while maintaining their core principles. Spring arrived late but warm, and with it came new life to the forest. Kota had found a mate over the winter, a young female who seemed to understand and support his role in the community. Watching them work together, Ethan saw the future of the system Ursa had created. It wouldn't end with Kota any more than it had begun with Ursa. It would continue, evolve, grow, as long as there were creatures willing to choose cooperation over pure competition, community over isolation. The day Jessica returned one last time, she came alone and with a different energy than before. She didn't bring cameras or equipment, just herself and a question. "I need to know," she said to Ethan, "not for science, not for publication, just for myself. Is it real? What I saw that day, was it what I thought it was?" Ethan considered for a long moment, then nodded. "It's real," he said simply. "More real than most of what we call civilization." Jessica was quiet for a long time, then asked, Can I just watch, not study, not document, just witness?" Ethan brought her to the edge of the territory, where they could observe without disturbing. They watched as Kota led a gathering, as animals of different species collaborated on extending the stone pathways, as young ones were taught the meanings of the symbols. Jessica cried, silently but steadily, for nearly an hour. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, humbled. "Everything I thought I knew about intelligence, about consciousness, about what makes us special, it's all wrong, isn't it?" Ethan nodded. "Not wrong," he said gently, "just incomplete. We're not alone in being aware, in creating meaning. We're just alone in thinking we're alone." As summer deepened, the Forest Society continued to flourish under Kota's leadership. New innovations appeared, including what looked like a primitive calendar system marked by different colored stones that tracked the seasons and possibly even lunar cycles. The sharing stations evolved into something more complex, with different resources distributed according to what seemed like a points system, though how animals kept track of points without writing was beyond Ethan's understanding. Yet somehow they did, each creature knowing what it had contributed and what it was owed. The artist Lily had become a regular visitor, always respectful, always maintaining the distance required. Her paintings had evolved too, becoming more abstract but somehow more true, capturing not the physical reality of what she witnessed, but its emotional and spiritual significance. She had started leaving small offerings at the forest edge, beautiful stones or interesting pieces of wood, never expecting anything in return. But one day she found one of her offerings had been woven into the branch patterns, incorporated into the communication system itself. Art acknowledging art across the species barrier. The most profound moment of that summer came when Kota's mate gave birth to cubs, 2 small bundles of fur that represented not just new life, but the continuation of a legacy. Watching Kota teach his cubs as Ursa had taught him, showing them how to place stones, how to read the patterns, how to participate in the community, Ethan felt the full circle of life in a way he never had before. These cubs would grow up in a world where cooperation between species was normal, where the laws their grandmother created were as natural as breathing. One evening, as Ethan sat by his cabin reflecting on everything he had witnessed, he realized that he had been changed in ways that went beyond knowledge or understanding. He saw the world differently now, not as a hierarchy with humans at the top, but as a web of consciousness with many different forms of intelligence, many different ways of creating meaning in society. The arrogance of human exceptionalism had been replaced by something better, a sense of belonging to a larger community of aware beings, each contributing their own unique perspective to the grand experiment of life. His decision to write about it came slowly, carefully. Not a scientific paper or a sensational exposé, but a story, fiction as far as anyone would know, that might plant seeds of wonder in those who read it. He changed details, obscured locations, made it impossible for anyone to find or disturb what he had been privileged to witness. But the essence remained true. The idea that intelligence and society and even law were not human inventions, but properties of consciousness itself, manifesting wherever beings chose cooperation over conflict. The manuscript took him months to complete, and he shared it with only 2 people before considering publication. Lily read it and wept, recognizing the truth within the fiction. Jessica, who had become a different kind of scientist after her experience, one more interested in observation than experimentation, read it and immediately understood what he was doing. "It's perfect," she said. "Those who need to understand will feel the truth of it. Those who don't won't believe it's anything more than a beautiful story." Fall returned with its palette of golds and reds, and the forest community prepared for another winter with the efficiency born of experience and shared knowledge. The stone monument had new additions, including what appeared to be a map of the extended territory, now covered by the cooperative system. Other communities of animals had adopted variations of Ursa's laws, adapting them to their own needs and environments, creating a network of peaceful coexistence that stretched for miles through the wilderness. Ethan's role had evolved too. He was no longer just an observer, but a recognized part of the forest community, albeit a peripheral one. Animals would acknowledge him as he passed, not with fear or aggression, but with the same casual acceptance they showed each other. He had become part of the story, woven into the fabric of the forest's secret civilization. Sometimes he would find small gifts at his cabin door. A particularly beautiful feather, an interesting stone, once even a piece of honeycomb left by bees who had somehow been incorporated into the system. The final revelation came on a night when the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, a rare occurrence this far south. Ethan had climbed to a high ridge to watch the display when he noticed he wasn't alone. Animals had gathered here too, all facing the sky, all watching the lights with what looked like the same wonder he felt. In that moment, he understood that the appreciation of beauty, the sense of awe at the universe's mysteries, wasn't uniquely human either. These creatures felt wonder, experienced beauty, shared in the cosmic amazement that the aurora inspired. As he stood there among them, no longer separate but part of the watching crowd, Ethan thought about Ursa and the legacy she had left. She had done more than create a system of laws for forest animals. She had proved that consciousness, wherever it arose, tended toward cooperation, toward creating meaning and beauty in society. She had shown that what humans called civilization was not an invention but a discovery, something that conscious beings stumbled upon independently when they chose community over isolation. The story Ethan eventually published was read by thousands, though most considered it simply a beautiful fable about the hidden intelligence of nature. But here and there, readers understood something deeper. felt the truth beneath the fiction. Some of them began to look at the animals around them differently, to notice patterns they had dismissed as instinct, to recognize intelligence in forms they had never considered. The seed Ursa had planted was spreading, not through scientific papers or dramatic revelations, but through a quiet shift in perspective, one person at a time. Years passed, and Ethan grew old in his forest cabin, watching as Koda's cubs grew and had cubs of their own, as the system Ursa created evolved and spread, as new generations of animals grew up in a world where cooperation across species was simply how things were done. He documented it all, filling journal after journal with observations that would one day be found and perhaps understood for what they really were, a record of parallel civilization, a testament to the universal tendency of consciousness toward community. On his final visit to the stone monument, now weathered by years but still standing strong, still being added to by each new generation, Ethan traced his finger over the mark he had made that night so long ago. Around it, hundreds of other marks had been added, the ongoing constitution of a society that most of the world didn't know existed. He thought about Ursa, about the courage it must have taken to imagine something different, to create laws where none had existed, to teach cooperation where competition had ruled. As he walked back through the forest for what he somehow knew would be the last time, every stone path, every woven branch, every carefully maintained boundary spoke of her vision, realized and exceeded. The forest had become a living testament to the possibility of peace, not through the absence of conflict, but through the choice to create something better. Animals that should have been enemies shared resources. Predators and prey coexisted within agreed boundaries, and all of it worked because one bear had imagined it could. Ethan's legacy, like Ursa's, lived on in ways he couldn't have imagined. The book he had written inspired others to look more carefully at the natural world, to question assumptions about animal intelligence and consciousness. Scientists began to study animal cooperation with new eyes, finding evidence of complex social structures they had previously dismissed. The secret of the forest remained safe, but the idea it represented spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in minds ready to accept that humans were not alone in their capacity for society, law, and civilization. Lilly's paintings, now hanging in galleries around the world, continued to capture something essential about interspecies cooperation without ever revealing their source. People stood before them and felt something shift in their understanding, though they couldn't always say what. Jessica had become a voice for a new kind of science, one that observed without disrupting, that acknowledged the possibility of non-human intelligence without trying to measure it by human standards. Both women carried the secret of what they had witnessed, protecting it while sharing its essence with the world. The forest itself thrived. The system Ursa had created now so established that new animals entering the territory quickly learned and adapted to its rules. It had become more than law. It had become culture, passed down through generations, evolved and refined, but always maintaining the core principle Ursa had established, that cooperation led to better outcomes for all than competition ever could. The stone monument stood as a physical reminder of this principle, but the real monument was the living community itself, proof that consciousness, in whatever form it took, could choose to create rather than destroy. On quiet mornings, when mist hung low over the forest floor and the world seemed to hold its breath, you could sometimes hear it, that low humming that had no single source but seemed to come from the forest itself. It was the sound of agreement, of community, of conscious beings choosing to be more than their instincts dictated. It was the sound Ursa had started with her first carefully placed stone, a vibration that continued long after she was gone, rippling out through the forest, and perhaps, in ways too subtle to measure, through the world itself. The truth that Ethan had discovered, that Ursa had demonstrated, was both simple and revolutionary. Intelligence was not rare but common, consciousness not unique but universal, and the tendency toward cooperation in society was not a human invention, but a natural expression of aware beings recognizing their interdependence. The forest constitution was not an anomaly, but an example of what was possible when conscious creatures chose community over isolation, law over chaos, cooperation over competition. As the seasons turned and years passed, the secret civilization of the forest continued to evolve, adapting to new challenges, incorporating new members, always growing, but never losing sight of the fundamental principles Ursa had established. Each generation added their own innovations while respecting the wisdom of those who came before. The young bear, who had once destroyed stone arrangements in frustration, had become one of the most dedicated maintainers of the system, teaching newer generations the importance of every carefully placed stone, every woven branch. The impact of Ursa's vision extended far beyond what any human observer could track. Animals who migrated through the territory carried ideas with them to distant forests. Birds who nested in the area for a season took concepts of cooperation back to their wintering grounds. The principles of mutual aid and structured cooperation spread through the natural world in ways that would take human scientists decades to recognize and even longer to understand. But spread they did, proof that good ideas, like life itself, find ways to propagate and flourish. In his final journal entry, Ethan wrote about the profound gift he had been given, the privilege of witnessing something that challenged every assumption about consciousness, intelligence, and society. He wrote about Ursa with the reverence usually reserved for great human leaders, because that's what she had been. A visionary who saw beyond the limitations of her species, who imagined and then created a better way for all. He wrote about Coda and the continuation of that vision, about the cubs who would carry it forward, about the endless possibility represented by conscious beings choosing cooperation. The last line of his journal read simply, "We are not alone in our consciousness, not unique in our ability to create society, not special in our capacity for law and cooperation. We are part of a vast community of aware beings, each finding our own way to create meaning and structure in the chaos of existence. Ursa showed me this truth, and it has made all the difference." The journal was found weeks later by Lily, who had come to check on him when he hadn't answered her calls. She found him peaceful in his chair, facing the window that looked out on the forest he had loved, the secret he had protected, still safe. The memorial service was small, just a few people who had known and understood what Ethan had discovered. But in the forest, there was another gathering. Animals who had known him, who had accepted him as part of their community, marked his passing in their own way. A new symbol was added to the stone monument, simple but distinctive, marking the place of the human who had witnessed without exploiting, who had understood without destroying, who had become part of the story without trying to own it. Coda, now fully grown into his role as leader, stood before the stone for a long moment after adding the mark. Perhaps he remembered the human who had watched from the shadows as his mother taught him to place his first stone. Perhaps he simply recognized the passing of a member of the extended community. Either way, the acknowledgement was real, the grief genuine, the respect earned through years of quiet coexistence. The human observer had become part of the forest's story, woven into its history as surely as any bear or badger or bird. As night fell on the forest, the monument stood in moonlight, its surface covered with the marks of countless creatures over unknown years. Each mark told a story, represented a life, recorded an agreement or a law or a moment of significance. Together, They formed a testament to the possibility of peace through structure, of harmony through law, of diverse species choosing to live by agreed principles rather than pure instinct. It was a constitution written not in words but in symbols, not by one species but by many, not imposed but agreed upon through patient demonstration and gradual acceptance. The legacy of Ursa lived on in every stoned path that guided animals through the forest, in every woven branch that communicated information across species barriers, in every young animal that learned the rules and chose to follow them. But more than that, it lived on in the idea that had spread far beyond this forest. The revolutionary notion that consciousness and society were not human monopolies but universal potentials, waiting to be expressed wherever aware beings chose cooperation over conflict. In the end, the story that had begun with a mother bear teaching her cub to place stones had become something much larger. It had become proof that intelligence takes many forms, that society can emerge from any conscious community, and that the laws we create to live together peacefully are not impositions but expressions of our deepest wisdom. Ursa had not just created a forest constitution. She had revealed a fundamental truth about consciousness itself, its tendency toward order, cooperation, and community. The forest sleeps now under a blanket of stars, but it is not a simple sleep. It is the rest of a functioning society, a community bound by laws they created themselves, a civilization that exists parallel to but separate from human society. Tomorrow, Koda will wake and continue the work his mother started, teaching young ones the meaning of the stones, maintaining the pathways that connect the community, adding new marks to the monument that records their ongoing story. The constitution Ursa created continues to evolve, continues to grow, continues to prove that conscious beings, whatever their form, can choose to be more than their biology dictates. And somewhere, in forests and fields around the world, other animals are watching, learning, perhaps beginning their own experiments in cooperation and society. The seed Ursa planted has scattered on the wind, taking root in places no human will ever document, creating communities no scientist will ever study. The secret civilization of the forest is no longer unique, but part of a growing network of conscious beings, choosing structure over chaos, cooperation over competition, law over lawlessness. This is Ursa's true legacy, not just the stones and branches she arranged, not just the system she created, but the idea she proved possible, that consciousness, wherever it arises, can choose to create rather than destroy, to cooperate rather than compete, to build societies based on mutual benefit rather than individual gain. She showed that what humans call civilization is not a human invention but a universal possibility, available to any conscious beings willing to imagine something better than the pure state of nature. The story ends where it began, with a bear and her cub in a forest, teaching and learning, creating and maintaining, proving every day that intelligence and society are not rare exceptions, but natural expressions of consciousness itself. The Constitution continues to be written, one stone, one branch, one agreement at a time, by creatures who have chosen to be more than their instincts, to create meaning where none existed, to build a society that serves all rather than few. And in this choosing, in this creation, they prove that we are none of us alone in our consciousness, none of us unique in our capacity for society, all of us part of something larger and more beautiful than we ever imagined.